welcome to a Prehistory Guys special. I'm Michael Bott.
And I'm Rupert Soskin.
Yeah, incest uncovered at the elite prehistoric Newgrange monument in Ireland.
Read those headlines.
Newgrange tomb body belonged to royal-like male born of incest. DNA from ancient Irish tomb reveals incest and an elite class that ruled early farmers. Do we see a sort of theme developing here?
They couldn't hold back, could they? They couldn't hold back.
No, but I tell you what a gift to Trinity College Dublin.
That's true, actually. That is true, yes. Yeah. Dr. Lara Cassidy, it's a fantastic piece of research. It's quite a team of people on this, isn't it?
Yeah. And we should say, that it's one of those cases where these headlines, as I said, I could have gone on and on, which if you have an interest in prehistory and take note of, whatever pops up in the mainstream media, you will have noticed these headlines. And of course, they're as ever, as we're finding, behind the headlines, there is a whole wealth of other stuff, because archaeologists don't set out to create headlines. They set out to find out stuff, and support a theory or debunk a theory themselves. Often the purposes are so much more subtle and
it has to be said,
than what comes out in the headlines.
The ramifications of this discovery. I mean, okay, so you've got the wonderful headline stuff of incest, but the ramifications in terms of our knowledge about people is just huge and really exciting. It's actually extremely far-reaching, and we're not quite sure where it's going to end at the moment, are we?
Yeah. Have you got the title of the actual paper that all this comes from in front of you?
I have. Hold on a second.
Excellent. What is the actual title?
It's the paper headed by Lara Cassidy. It's a dynastic elite in monumental Neolithic society.
There you have it. No mention of Newgrange, no mention of Ireland. Yeah.
Yes. You see, that in itself, it's very telling how you need to read behind the headlines.
Yeah.
It's I think, where do we start with this, Michael? I mean, it's the fact that DNA, once again, its modern scientific techniques have allowed us to glimpse into the deep past and get an amount of information that tells us about people on a level that was never possible before. And what's so significant about this, and the headline of the paper, a dynastic elite in monumental Neolithic society. We are looking at a dynasty in terms of people related across numerous important burial sites. And that in itself is enormous, especially when we look at its roots. I mean, where should we start on that, Michael? Should we go to Bristol?
Well, I think the roots of this are the purpose in the first place of the paper itself. And what I take away from it is that they were starting with the idea that building of megalithic sites and these passage tombs, etc., in particular, took an awful lot of manpower. There's one school of thought that has it, well, there must have been a huge egalitarian society, to have cooperated in such a way with each other to produce such extraordinary buildings. And there's another school of thought, that says, experience really teaches you that in order for these sorts of things to happen, you've got to have quite a hierarchy going on and a revered upper echelon commanding stuff that actually happens. And that, I think, was the purpose of this study, to see through the DNA in the burials in these kinds of tombs, if the DNA could tell anything about hierarchy and familial relationships between the people that were in those tombs. And we have to say that, Rupert,
What, starting in Brittany, you mean? We have to go back to
Brittany.
Brittany.
I was going to say, I mean, they've nailed it. They've succeeded in doing that.
Yeah.
That is what the DNA tells us, that
Yeah.
there was an elite in these tombs that were related.
It's funny. I mean, in some ways, it shouldn't be a surprise, should it? That that any major burial site that you can mention. So we don't even have to look in terms of the biggest and most impressive of the passage tombs. Any of the most significant burials have got very small numbers of people within them, which means that it's a given that we know that these were burials for the elite of society. They weren't the burials for the masses. So if you've got something, I have to say, one of the funny things about all the research that's been coming out now and the way they've been describing Newgrange itself, that they're giving the weight of it 200,000 tons of structure. And I think it's a very funny way of describing how important something is, going by weight. But clearly, it's the elite of a society. Now, whether it was an elite priesthood or an elite ruling dynasty, we can't escape the correlations with something like dynastic Egypt, can we? Where you had
when we take the incest into consideration, yes.
And lavish burials for very small numbers of individuals. But as you were saying, that following this from Brittany and from the major passage tombs of Brittany and coming up into mainland Britain, so Maes Howe in Scotland.
Okay. And what about Bryn Celli Ddu on Anglesey?
Good point.
If we're going to talk about solar-aligned passage tombs. Yeah, if the same thing is pertained. So the study was of 44
individuals,
individuals, two of which I believe were from the Mesolithic. And then again, we've got another story attached to this in terms of the genetics of hunter-gatherers as opposed to the genetics of the early Neolithic farmers, if we can use that to distinguish them.
Well, that in itself is an important distinction to make, isn't it? That the DNA has shown that Ireland, the island of Ireland, was isolated culturally, was isolated from the rest of Britain and Europe forever. It's amazing how the Irish Sea it seemed to be this enormous barrier for them. They had no desire to cross that water to get to Ireland. It wasn't until the Neolithic that anything changed.
Yeah.
What was the impetus?
So the comparison is the Irish island, the DNA from the island of Ireland, hunter-gatherer DNA, compared to mainland Britain, hunter-gatherer DNA, and they're quite separate. They've drifted apart over a period of time, and the whole thing suggests that Doggerland was still maintaining, the gene mix across to the continent up until such time.
Yeah,
but there had been little or no contact across the Irish Sea.
There is no genetic distinction. If you look at the DNA, there is no distinction between people in Britain at the time and their continental contemporaries. The people in Ireland are fundamentally different. It's marked. It's remarkable.
So that's another byproduct of the study. But before we haven't really got to the incest part of it, what was found in the bones that are being called NG10, which would be Newgrange.
Newgrange 10, yes.
We'll call him NG10 for clarity's sake. But before we get to him, it's the familial relationships across the burials in various tomb types in Ireland that give the weight to the success of the purpose of this study.
Yes, it's a remarkable discovery to have made in the first place, but finding quite how far-reaching it is across the sites in Ireland as well, finding out that there was interrelatedness through many of the key burial sites and megalithic cemeteries on Ireland. So you've got something from Newgrange, and Millin Bay is the furthest east, isn't it? And there's a site in Millin Bay which is right on the east, over near Portaferry. And then going in, you've got Newgrange, and then over in Sligo and in County Clare. And so there are numbers of burial sites where the DNA has shown that there's interrelatedness between the individuals buried. It's huge. It's it's
both over time and over distance.
Yes,
which is the thing that speaks to.
In another interesting aspect there as well is how we. When I say we, I mean us people today culturally. We have this view of things in the past that somehow we regard them in a different way. So, for example, they've talked about these burials over time, over half a millennium. And you think, well, big deal. Culturally, we've been doing the same thing for well over 1,000 years in mainland Europe, particularly in Britain. Culturally, we haven't shifted a great deal at all in 1,000 years. So to say that this is over a vast period of time, it's not actually. It's in culturally comparatively short period of time, half a millennium. Because we've got it's a curious thing, isn't it? We've got a date of Newgrange itself is dated to 3,200 BC. These burials, so half a millennium, you're talking about, 2,500 BC, I think is the latest that we're looking at, isn't it? I think that's right. It does smack of, we still do the same now with our royal burials. We're using the same burial sites for our elite.
For sure, yeah. So, before we talk about incest at Newgrange, aside from that, and I suppose the incest aspect at Newgrange is the thing that's kind of nails it. It's a cherry on the cake, It really helps the case hugely, but I think the case would be good without the incest at Newgrange anyway. But my huge takeaway from it is, my huge implication from it all, is that we can't get away from at the very least, the solar aspects of this and the alignment of the passage tombs with the heavens, usually related to the sun. And if we're talking about the burial of an elite inside these tombs, we must be looking at an elite that were regarded in some relationship to the sun. One hesitates to use the term sun king, sun god, whatever like that. But at the same time, it's hard to, you can't.
It's hard not to. It's hard not to.
It's hard not to, isn't it? And to think of that kind of dynastic ruling going on, which probably originated. We're not saying this DNA wasn't to do with DNA in Brittany so far, exactly, but the implications of the style and the culture of those kinds of tombs coming from Brittany, then you've got to imagine this sort of dynastic culture extending through and persisting in Ireland, particularly. And that is my sort of big takeaway. The idea of an elite related to a deity, related to the sun, and then being worshipped, and a huge amount of effort being, rather like Egypt, a huge amount of effort being put into making sure they were taken care of in relationship to the sun the skies, the heavens where they belonged.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, we've made this point before, but it does kind of make you wonder quite how much our, Christian sites, churches built aligned east-west just because that's a convention. And it makes you wonder if that is yet another of the aspects of Christianity that was imported, if you like, from earlier pagan cultures.
Sorry, Rupert. I was just going to ask you though, what your takeaway? I know it's sort of similar to mine, but you had a slightly different spin on it.
Yeah, but for me, it's people. It's the fact that technology is increasingly taking us down this road where we are understanding people more. We're getting past isn't the right word. We're going beyond seeing what people have left behind and actually getting to understand...
Going beyond the pots.
Pots, yeah, absolutely, pots. And we're getting to understand more about their lives rather than what they actually left behind. And, I hesitate to touch on this because we don't know. And it's a good job that we're going to be talking about the mythology of stuff. But one of the things that is impossible to avoid here is that if you look at the tales of the Milesians, these people who ended up in the island of Ireland, and what were their roots? And if you trace the roots right back, then the stories say that they came from Egypt, don't they? They certainly came from the Middle East and over in that direction. And then when you look at these cultural correlations of a dynastic, incestuous elite where the importance of maintaining a bloodline just runs more powerfully throughout. And then to the correlations with the pyramids, with alignments with the heavens, for example. You can't avoid, even though there is no specific evidence to say that you can connect the two, one cannot avoid the correlations. They're
and of course the Milesians are associated with a much later.
Much later.
Invasion.
Yes, they're of what we know, Iron Age. But then, how far back does any mythology
the connections go?
Pardon?
Yeah.
I didn't hear what you said there.
How far back the connections go?
Yes.
Yeah. So moving on to the headline, really, and the fact that it's the cherry on the cake. I think I said before that NG10 is a result of a coupling between parent and sibling, or a parent and...
Well, they're thinking it's most likely brother-sister, but could just as easily have been parent-offspring.
Which neatly kind of brings us on to the mythology.
Yes.
Because we are told...
Well, we should probably talk to the man himself, shouldn't we? Really,
Mr. Irish mythology himself, or...
Mr. Irish mythology himself. Because our friend Anthony Murphy, he what he doesn't know about the mythology, well, you could write it on the back of a stamp, couldn't you?
And I think this has lit up his life a bit as well, hasn't it?
It's extraordinary how when you see stories coming true. I hesitate to use those words, but I'm going to do it anyway. That when you've heard these legends and myths over time, and then suddenly you find that science says, "Well, there you go. Looks like that was a winner."
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, we cover all this because the rest of this program is a conversation with Anthony Murphy of Mythical Ireland fame, runs the website. Mr. Dronehenge himself, would you believe?
Mr. Dronehenge himself, that's true, yes.
Yeah, and of course Anthony has the advantage of living at or near the Brúna Bóinne, and he's made it his a large part of his life to completely embed himself in the mythology. So without further ado, let's have a chat with Anthony, shall we?
Yes.
Welcome, Anthony. Welcome back, I should say, to Prehistory.
Definitely
guys.
Welcome back. It's lovely to have you back on again.
It seems like a long time since we chatted last. A quick précis of what's been going on for you.
Last one. Well, during the lockdown, I started this series called Live Irish Myths, and I live streamed every day for 103 days. And that was really great because, on the one hand, there was this lovely community built up around it. And on the other hand, it was giving me an opportunity to learn, actually, because I was finding I was reading stuff that I hadn't read before.
Fantastic, yeah.
And potentially material for future books, etc., etc.
Right.
Great news that Island of the Setting Sun is being republished. It's been out of print for about 8 years. And
Congratulations, that's good.
Yeah, a special 2020 edition will hopefully be available in early to mid-August, all going well. And in the background, I've also been writing another book, and having written 55,000 words of it, I realised that, in fact, it needs to be 2 books, 2 separate themes that are divergent to pull together in one. So that's going to be interesting and challenging. But Mythical Ireland has been very, very busy, and no complaints on this side.
How long may it be so? Yeah, I mean, so Newgrange and incest aside, you've got plenty of work on your hands.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about that very thing, the discovery.
It was the first thing that Michael and I said, really, when we'd gone through all this stuff, and when the papers came out, that all this going on at Newgrange, and it was one of the first things we said was, we've just got to get Anthony on to talk about this. Any of the mythological connections are just, it's riveting to see how far back oral history and oral tradition how far it can stretch into the past.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, I have long suggested that several myths are, contain information that would, in my view, put them way back in prehistory. Mm-hmm. In one or two cases, actually, pre-Neolithic. But it's an area where the scholars, I suppose I can't blame them either. They've got all their peers looking over their shoulder. They don't want to sort of venture too far into that territory because it is hazy territory at best. But I'm hoping today that we can discuss 3 separate myths about Newgrange, which might shed light on this latest finding, and which I think may help us lean towards that hypothesis that, in fact, some of these myths are really, really ancient.
Fantastic. There's one question that I'd like to ask you right up front, and that is that the papers were all talking about the translation of the name for Douth as the Hill of Sin or the Hill of Incest. Yeah. And I thought I would ask you, what is the truth of that? Is that journalistic stretching it a bit, or what is the actual translation of the Irish name?
Well, I have to defer to the scholars. I don't know where that came from. I did look for this. Ferta can mean a mound or a hillock or a grave mound. Coile, could be a corruption of coile as in a wood, particularly a hazel wood. There's a lot of Irish place names with kill in them, C-I-L-L or K-I-L-L, which is either translated from church or wood. Mm-hmm. I couldn't find this sin thing, but I am not an Irish scholar of any repute, I can tell you. So I don't exactly know where it comes from. I have to urge a little bit of caution here, because if it is sin, if it is the mound of sin or the hill of sin, it is likely, of course, that is one of the many incursions into pagan mythology by the ecclesiastical scribe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, the Dinshanicus, the very same myth about Doubt speaks about the mound. It doesn't call it a mound, it calls it a tower, and it compares it to the Tower of Nimrod. So obviously there are Old Testament references in there which suggest that the story has been altered to better suit the biblical and
Christian sensibilities, yes.
Right.
I should just mention that I'm working quite energetically on a blog post about this, which I'll publish in the next week or so, about the relationship of Christian scribes to the pagan mythology and how it might have been changed, etc. There are lots and lots of examples of that. And so I just step back a little bit from that one and urge caution on it, you know?
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I don't know. I think we should just toss it to you, Anthony. What are the 3 myths that you want to tell us about?
Well, the most... the one that's... actually, the only one that's really been discussed publicly is the myth about the legend of Doubt. And just for the benefit of your viewers... that myth can be compressed into a few sentences. A king whose name is Bresal Bodibad, meaning lacking in cattle. During his reign, there's a cattle famine, and all the cattle die, except for there's only 1 bull and 7 cows left. He brings all the men of Ireland to this place, Douth, to build him a tower from which he can pass to heaven, alike to the Tower of Nimrod. Now, in order for this task to be completed, the men ask for basically eternal daylight. So the king's sister works a magic spell on the sun and makes it stand still in the sky. I think this is a summer solstice myth. And I refer to the work of Professor Ronald Hicks of Ball State University in Indiana on this, that she makes the sun stand still in the sky so that there's endless day. Now, of course, at summer solstice, which is only just passed in the past week and a half, there's eternal twilight at night time. Sorry, I need to close that because the birds are singing. At this time of year, there is an endless twilight. And actually, I've been at Douth with Richard Moore, my co-author on Island of the Setting Sun. Several years we went at midnight on the summer solstice, and we found that with very little adjustment, you can see what you're doing. And if you were working, you could work through the night. And that's just, of course, a hypothetical question. But something happens then. The king, lust seizes the king, and he commits incest with his sister at a place called Bertaculla, which apparently means the hill of sin. And the spell is broken. A sudden darkness comes on the place, and the men say, well, we've been promised endless day for this task, and as night has come on and day has gone, we're going to abandon the place, and forevermore it shall be known as Dua, which is the Irish for... Now, you'll see that the Old Irish is D-U-B-A-D, but of course when you add in the lenition, Dua, which basically means darkness or darkening, the act of darkness.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, I think that's a total eclipse myth as well. But it's curious the way the tale relates the breaking of the spell to the incestuous relationship. It's as if something has happened there to despoil the magic, as it were. And the sun, of course, does what it always does every year. We get to this time of year and we go, oh, this is brilliant. These days are really it's bright at 11 o'clock at night and it's bright at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks later, we start to head back into winter again, The
thing that springs to my mind is that if we're talking about this discovery supporting the idea of an elite hierarchy, that the way you're framing or, relating this myth, that there is contained within it an awareness that the incest is a bad thing, or is that a Christian spin on the myth? This is the things we don't know. There seems to be a consciousness of the significance of there being an incestuous relationship that seems to be echoing down the ages there, which wouldn't necessarily be signalled if it was a normal thing or something that was expected within that elite, or was ordained within that elite.
It's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, regrettably, the myth does not answer it for us, really. No. Another question there too, Michael, which is the question pertaining to, this is something I've written about, I wrote about it in my book called Mythical Ireland. I wrote about whether the people who were involved in the monument construction did so under duress or coercion, or whether in fact they were happy to participate, as the result of some sort of communal zeal towards this grand project. And you look at the doubt myth and you say that the king commanded all the men of Erin, which is exactly what it says. Some of the women have taken issue with this. I have personally been accused of being sexist, and I have to point to the myth, which only refers to the men. It doesn't say what the women were doing. They were probably doing something far more important. As long ago as 2006, when I wrote Island of the Setting Sun, I did say that it struck me that Bressel was a sort of a megalomaniac king, that he would command all the men of Ireland to one place to build him a town from which he could pass to heaven. And of course, I think in there is a hint at what the monuments were about in the eyes of the builders, which is about passage to another world. And so the word she, which is an Irish word, in Old Irish, S-I father D, pronounced like the word she, as in feminine, they are portals to other realms. That's what they are. The very best translation. And there are a lot of Irish words that can't be accurately or I suppose properly translated into English. She is one of those. It doesn't, like, it's often translated as an elf mound or a fairy mound, but the very best translation of it is an otherworld mound. And so the idea was that I'm going to build me a big monument, a big mother of a monument, and it's going to be ostentatious. It's going to be bigger than anything that's ever been built on the island of Ireland. Remember that we believe that Doubt was the first of the three great monuments to be built. And I'm going to bring all the men of Ireland here to build it for me. It does kind of speak to a narrative of, yes, I am the leader and they are the followers or the slaves or whatever.
Yeah.
What it doesn't do is it doesn't answer it definitively. On the question of incest, I would urge serious caution on that. As I said, there are so many examples of myths. I mean, the very question arises, why did Irish ecclesiastical scribes write down pagan mythology?
Yeah.
Wouldn't their time have been better spent writing the Gospels and mass books and missals, etc., etc.? Why did they spend so much time? Of course, the answer to that is very complex, but in simplest form, it is because the scribes were part of monasteries, and the monasteries, of course, were granted their lands and their power by the chiefs and the kings. And there was often a very powerful interrelation of church and state, or church and politics. And in fact, in some of the kings, there was a king of Cashel who was actually a bishop as well as a king. So you imagine that the scribes are always looking over their shoulder, on the one hand at the abbot, who wants things to be Christianized, and on the other hand to the sponsor, the chief or the king, who basically wants the myths to strengthen his own lineage. And of course, there's a whole different discussion there. I would definitely urge caution. It seems to me as if the idea that incest is a sinful thing is introduced into the Dinshanachas by the ecclesiastical scribes. Yeah. That would be my view, but again, with the proviso that I'm not a medieval scholar, and nor am I a scholar of early Irish.
Understood.
Yes, but it is interesting how we can see from the actual DNA that's been taken from Newgrange and everything that's telling us that these myths. So how far back would you estimate that the myths are actually beginning to absorb the pagan history, if you want to call it that, with the Christian twist? So for example, it would not have been called the Hill of Sin until the Christians got, or the ecclesiastical side of it, things got a hold of it. So can you find a sort of a middle ground of time? Can you put a rough date of when that was adopted from the oral tradition into the twisted history, if you want to put it that way? Do you see what I mean?
We can be specific enough about that because the Dindshenachus is contained. Well, there are actually 6 or 7 different manuscripts with the Dindshenachus, but we're actually talking about that period of time when we're all of these things were written down. Probably, I think the earliest version of the Dindshenachus is 12th century.
Right.
And I think, in fact, you can probably say within a few centuries, maybe before that. Remember that, the monasteries, the larger monasteries especially, came with the Benedictine order and the Cistercians in the 12th century. And so previous to that, an awful lot of the monasteries that were extant at that time, pre the Norman invasion, they would have been smaller affairs. It's very hard to say because, for instance, the whole thing about marriage, priests were married in the first millennium, the ruling out, the whole issue of celibacy didn't really become widespread until actually the 15th or 16th century, having been first practiced, I think, in around the 12th century. Now, it is likely that incest was taboo anyway in most, Christian settings, but also perhaps in the non-Christian settings. It's a very, very good question, which I can't answer, obviously. Yeah, I'm trying. I would say that you have to remember that these things are written down, and as they're being written down, they're being altered to suit that biblical worldview. So, probably at the time they were written down, that's when they were changed.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said that there's not just the one myth that relates to the discovery, but there are 3 in total. My goodness.
Yes. This has been apparently kind of overlooked or forgotten.
Okay.
There are 2 more very important. Well, it's a funny thing. There's a lot of myths that relate to Newgrange. Newgrange seems to have occupied this sort of primacy, this fascination in the stories. One of them pertains to the birth tale of the great warrior Cuchulainn of the Toynbee Cuailnge, which is a very famous Irish epic tale, the cattle raid of Cooley. And despite the protestations or the insistence of the scholars that this is a medieval myth that perhaps has origins in the Iron Age, there are also aspects of it that relate to primitive Indo-European creation mythology, the Battle of the Bulls and the scattering.
I've heard Maeve related to the cattle raid myth. Maeve's Cairn over in Sligo.
Maeve of Rathcroghan. You could say that it was her what started it, but only on the provocation of her husband Ailill, who basically they started to list off all the things that they owned. And she was going on about her lovely white bull, Finn Bennett, and that there was no finer bull anywhere to be found. And Ailill goes, I hate to tell you this, love, but there's a finer bull over in Cooley, the Dun Cooley. And thus begins a whole war, because it makes it known that she's going to have this bull by hook or by crook. Anyway, we are getting slightly distracted. Setanta, who was the boy hero before he became Cuchulainn, he was called Setanta. Setanta was conceived at Newgrange, according to the myths.
Oh, goodness.
This is fascinating, and it's something I wrote about in Island of the Setting Sun. His mother was Dectana, who is the sister of the King of Ulster. His name is Conor MacNessa, or Conchobar. And there are a flock of swans at Awan in Armagh, which is where they were ruled from, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Ulster. And they chase them off, and they follow them to Brunibonia. Now, there are various versions of the tale. In the one that I was following, and it's so funny the way the tales diverge on details, and then they're similar on details. But she comes to a place where they settle down for the night, and it's basically Newgrange, and it's basically snowing, so it's winter. And Lugh, who's the god, the great he's another sort of solar deity. He arrives in a dream and basically tells her that she's going to have a child. But it was Ronald Hicks who reminded me about a version of this story. Ronald Hicks, of course, as I mentioned, is a professor of anthropology at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And it was him that reminded me that, in fact, there's a commonly known version of the story in which Conchobar and Dectana are father and daughter, and they take refuge in what is likely to be Newgrange. I've got a quote here from what Ron sent me. Thereafter, Dectana became pregnant. Now, as I said, there is a version of the story in which Lugh comes to her and says, you're going to have a baby, and you're going to call it Setanta. And of course, this is what you might call a virgin birth. You know, this is stuff that's right out of the Bible, except for it's probably pre-biblical. Thereafter, Dectana became pregnant. The Uli, or the Ulstermen, were troubled, since they did not know the father, and they surmised that Conchobar had fathered the child while drunk, for Dectana used to sleep next to him. Conchobar then betrothed his daughter to Sualtam, son of Roich. Dectana was greatly embarrassed about going to Sualtam's bed, that she lay down in the bed and crushed the child within her. And this is part of the conception story. And of course, in the other version, there are several. I think the child has to be implanted, as it were, 3 times because she miscarries or she loses it in some way, and ends up drinking. She's at a feast and she's drinking from a cup, and there's a little worm in the cup, and she drinks the worm, and the worm goes into her belly, and suddenly she's pregnant. And then Lugh comes and says to her, by the way, that guy that came to you in the dream at Newgrange, that was me, and you're going to have a baby, and you're going to call him Setanta, and he's going to be very, very renowned. He's going to live a short but prolific, famous life. And of course, he does. The rest of the say is prehistory.
You make me want to go and read it all myself now.
Yeah, absolutely.
The hook here is the fact that while, you would imagine this is the sort of action that should happen at Awan, which is, Navan Fort, which is outside Armagh City. You would imagine that that's where the action should take place. But instead, there's this contrivance to make it happen at Newgrange.
Yeah.
It involves swans, and swans I've written lots about in astronomy and all the rest. But swans can be considered sort of psychopomps as well, other world guides. It's like the swans take them away from Awan to bring them to Newgrange. But it's Newgrange in winter with snow falling, and Lugh arrives. And it sort of very, very much makes it an otherworldly setting for the whole thing. But the fact that it pertains to possible incest and is really very interesting in my view.
Yeah. I think that's what's excited the minds of many people, that have read the headlines. Has that covered all myths that pertain, or is there one more?
There's a third, yeah.
There's a third.
there's a third, and this is probably the most important tale pertaining to Newgrange is the one called Tochmarc Étaíne, which means the wooing of Etaine. And this is a curious story in itself because until the 20th century, only a fragmented form of it existed in Laura Mahira, the Book of the Dun Cow, which is the earliest Irish manuscript that we have containing mythological tracts dating to the late 11th or early 12th century.
Right.
And it was only in the 20th century that another manuscript was discovered with a more complete version. And so we were able to stitch the whole story together from the different sources. It's curious because at the center of the action, or at the center of the story, is the most beautiful woman in Ireland, and her name is Etaine, or Etaine in modern Irish. And it's directly connected with Newgrange in the first part of the story. There are 3 parts, and the curious thing here is that in each of the 3 parts, Etaine returns and is central to the action. But the second part takes place 1,000 years after the first part, or the second and the third parts come 1,000 years later. It's suggesting perhaps that there's a theme here of reincarnation, as Etaine comes back. But that's not what's important here. In the first story, this is the famous story about how Angus Og gains ownership of Sheedenbroga, which is the old Irish name of Newgrange, and he is, his father is Dagda, who's a solar deity, and his mother is Boan or Boin. She's the deity who gives her name to the Boyne River, and Elkmar is Boan's husband, and he's the owner of Newgrange, Sheedenbroga, and Dagda comes along and he wishes to bed Elkmar's wife, Bowen, and he sends Elkmar away on an errand, and he casts magic spells on him and all the rest. That basically will see the dilation of time or the contraction of time, depending on your point of view. Elkmar will think that he's only away for 1 day, but in fact he'll be away for 9 months, which is long enough for the couple, as in Dagda and Bowen, to conceive Angus and for him to be born. Now, when he's born, he is secreted away, and he is fostered by Midger, M-I-D-I-R, Midger of Briley, which is a monument in Longford in sort of the Irish Midlands.
Okay.
So Elkmar comes back and doesn't know any different. He doesn't know that his wife has been unfaithful to him. Now, I'm going to try and cut a long story short, because it's the third part that really is the most significant. Angus is slagged off by some of the boys, his fellow foster brothers at Briley, because he doesn't know who his parents are. And he says to Midger, "Is this true?" And Midger says, "Look, I'll tell you who your folks are." And he brings him to see the Dagda. Dagda tells him to go to Newgrange and take Newgrange from Elkmar, and he does so successfully and ousts Elkmar, and Angus becomes the owner of Newgrange. In fact, even down to the 20th century, local people in the Boyne Valley referred to Newgrange as Brew Macanog, which means the brew of the young son, because,
right,
according to the myth, young was the son who was conceived at the beginning of the day and born between that and the evening of the same day, which is, again, to do with the dilation of time. By the way, when Dagda entered the house of Elkmar, which is how Newgrange was described, he made the sun stand still in the sky, which is a direct reference in mythological and symbolic language of the winter solstice illumination of the chamber. Anyway, in the second version, 1,000 years later, Yochi Aram is the king, the high king, and he weds Etaine. She's back in another form, and again, she's the most beautiful woman in Ireland. And his brother falls in love with her. His brother Ailil falls in love with her, and is so desperately in love with her that he pines away, and he's sick and he's dying. And he eventually confesses to Etaine the cause of his illness. He says, "Look, I'm madly in love with you, and I want to get into bed with you." And she says, "Well, look, we're not going to do that in the king's court." And so she agrees to meet him somewhere else. And what happens is that a phantom man, this sort of spectral character, comes to her and beds her. and later reveals to her after sleeping with her 3 times that in fact, I'm not Eileal, I'm Midger from the original story.
Yeah.
You were my woman originally, and you're going to be my woman again. In the third version of the story, Yochi Aram is still the king, and this time what happens is Midger comes to Tara, where he rules, and basically lets it be known that he wants Etaine. And all he's looking for initially is for a hug and a kiss from her. And the king actually agrees to this, but in agreeing to this, he adds certain onerous
conditions.
Conditions is the perfect word. And Midger has to do all sorts of tasks in order to get this. But on the appointed day, when the appointed day arrives, Midger is coming to Tara to get his hug and kiss from Etaine. Of course, Yochi has the whole place surrounded with all his warriors, and it is like breaking into Fort Knox. However, magically, Midger appears in the centre of the king's court amidst all the men. And of course, no one knows how he got in there. And he grabs Etaine, and they fly up through the smoke hole in the roof, and they disappear. And the men, confused, and the king go outside, and they see 2 swans flying off together. And this is most remarkable. But Yochi Aram is determined to have revenge, and his revenge is that he is going to destroy every sheed mound in Ireland until he finds this. You could use insert strong word here.
Here, yes.
Until he finds the horrible wretch who has stolen his wife. And so he destroys several of them, and then he comes to Brilay, which is the one you should go to in the first place because it's Midger's kind of home place. And he confronts Midger there, and steals Etaine back off Midger. I'll read this bit. This is from MacKillop's Oxford Dictionary of Celtic Mythology. I won't read enough of it to warrant any copyright infringement. Yochi and his men resolve to have Etaine back, even if it means destroying every she in Ireland. As Midger is thought to have flown to the She of Femin in the south, Yochi goes there without success, and so destroys many others, at last going on to Midger's residence at Brilay in the centre of Ireland. Midger responds by producing 50 women, all in the shape of Etaine, so that no one can tell who is the true queen. Yochi asserts, of course, he says, I know my queen. How does he know her? He knows her by the way she pours a drink.
Okay.
So he proceeds to watch all of the women pouring a drink until he finds the one. He says, nope, that's her. I know by the way she pours her drink. He chooses who he thinks is his wife by this test and resumes married life with her. But it is not Etaine. Midger, having bound Yochi to no further recriminations, tells him that the true Etaine was pregnant when they left Tara. In other words, when they flew out. And thus the woman who he has brought back to Tara to carry on married life with is in fact his own daughter, another Etaine. And that she shouldn't be confused with yet another daughter, Etaine. So there's more than 2 Etaines actually. Horrified at his deception, Yochi Aram lays waste to Brilay, rescues the true Etaine, his wife, and returns with her to Tara. The child of Yochi's incestuous union is put out to die, but she is found and raised by a herdsman and his wife. Once mature, she has the stateliness of her royal forebears and is celebrated for her fine embroidery. So here again in the stories we have a mention of incest. Now, yes. It's not immediately directly related to Newgrange because it's the third part of the story, and of course that relates mostly to Tara and to Brilay. Sure. But the fact of the matter is that what Tochmarc Étaíne represents, the 3 sections of it represent the effort of this otherworldly Midger, who's undoubtedly a Daidanan deity, to be with this beautiful lady, this otherworldly lady Etaine, eternally. And so in all 3 stories, it is fundamentally about him and her. And in the third one, there is deception of the king to the extent that the king ends up bedding his own daughter. So there are three, actually, three stories pertaining to incest and Newgrange.
The thing that always amazes me, and hearing you speak so eloquently to the myth, and you're where you live, you're sitting right on top of it. But I think hopefully the thing that people haven't been aware before, that are watching this show and hearing this interview, is how we have myth that has been written down and pertains directly to events so far back in time, where everywhere else all we've got to go on is pottery and a few bones.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? It's so, if you'll forgive what I'm about to say, it's so putting flesh on bones, and certainly helping spur our imaginations, together with the evidence that we get from the most incredible scientific investigations that can be done through isotopic stuff, through DNA, and all the rest of it, and how the evidence that has long been in the ground or that has been excavated, that's been extant and in the archaeological realm for so long, can be re-examined. And the story, again, I'm going to use that fleshed out word again. It's
a good one to use.
Wholly fleshed out, so that there is there's an overlap in between the written word and what people are extrapolating from raw data.
It becomes so much more magical and profound when you take it out of the realms of, we're talking about races and cultures, and now we're talking about people.
Yeah.
It just makes such a difference. Yeah.
I think the distinction that kind of struck me when I was reading this paper that we're referring to is that it's a story, well, it's got two halves to it. It's got the thing where we get closer to people and what people were up to at a particular moment in time. And yet at the same time, it's got this broad reach of history, not history, but the broad reach of several hundred years in which to contextualize that behavior, and bringing together cultures that may have extended right from Brittany, from the north west of France, up, and from the Atlantic seaboard to Ireland, and across even to Bryn Celli Ddu and Maes Howe, and other places that exhibit the tradition of the passage tomb, because that's the other thing that seems to link up. Newgrange, we call it a passage tomb, but that tradition seems to be linked to, and the mythology of the sun keeps coming up, and the arresting of time and all that. It seems so much to be tied up with some kind of worship in which the top echelons of whatever hierarchy it was were involved.
Yeah, I think what's interesting too is, well, of course, the truth is never black or white. It usually lies somewhere in the greys in between. Yeah. In this case, what's interesting about the Tuatha De Danann, who are related to the mounds, they're the ones who are said to have built the monuments. Yeah. And of course, the Christian scribes tried various methods by which to reconcile the De Danann mythology with their own beliefs to make it more acceptable. In some cases, they demonized them. They said they were fallen angels. They said that there were humans who had human lineages, etc., etc. And again, the truth is likely to be grey here rather than black or white. One wonders whether there were humans involved in the commanding of the building of these structures who were seen to have been god kings, were seen to have been deities. And afterwards, of course, it was very easy for them to become immortalized, even though there was a very significant change, as you know, with the introduction of the beaker horizon into things. And that was an entirely different DNA set from which the modern Irish population is mostly derived, is the beaker, not the Neolithic. And yet it would appear that aspects of the Neolithic culture survive in some of our myths. Now, there are Irish scholars who will say, no, absolutely not. The very fact that this myth refers to the Tower of Nimrod is proof that it was only written down and it was concocted in the Middle Ages or whatever. I disagree with that. I think that is just, as I say, an incursion or an effort on behalf of the scribe to make it more palatable to speak. What's interesting too about the paper is that they found a relationship between NG10 and some of the individuals from the Sligo complex.
Indeed, yeah.
And they had already, I think, ascertained in a previous study that bone, the people who were interred in the Sligo complex were part of it. Was the idea was that these were familial graves.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it brings to mind a whole question about who was buried in the monuments, which has, of course, been since O'Kelly, for instance, since Professor O'Kelly dug the first sod at Newgrange in 1962. This has been a question. Who was buried in there? Now, curiously, there weren't very many remains found in Newgrange, although I believe anecdotally it was said that some material was removed in the 2 centuries after the monument was opened up again in 1699 AD. But I just wonder whether, in fact, there wasn't a huge volume in the first place because it was set out for this particular ruling elite, or whatever you want to call them, this ruling family. And whether that's hinted at in the mythology, because in the myths, it's Dagda, Elkmar, and Angus are the owners of Newgrange. And it depends on which thread you read. Elkmar is the owner and is kicked out by Angus, or Dagda is the owner and is kicked out by his son Angus. And so it's limited. The ownership and the construction of the monument is said to have been carried out by Dagda. So one wonders. Another thing that's curious too is that throughout the past couple of centuries, anecdotally among the peasantry in Ireland, it was always said that the Irish were descended from the Milesians. But until about 7 or 8 years ago, the archaeologists would have said, no, we're descended from the Mesolithic culture, that in fact we have the genes of this culture, that this insular culture that seemed to have, according to the paper, the new paper about Newgrange, this culture lived relatively isolated, and that there didn't seem to have been many visitations from people at that time from mainland Britain or from Europe.
Absolutely, yeah.
But in fact, DNA studies have shown us only in the past decade that the folklore, the folk belief was true all along. If you were to propose, as I have done, that Danann mythology refers to the Neolithic and Milesian mythology refers to the Beaker / Bronze Age, then you see the mythology being true all along, which is that in fact we have this descent from the Beaker culture. So genetics all of a sudden in a decade, not even a decade, has completely revolutionized and, as I said, gone some significant way to answering the questions. In relation to the incest, one problem which remains, and I don't think is answerable in the modern age, which is this whole question pertaining to, was it taboo? What was the opinion of the masses about, the incestuous union of the people who are obviously going to be interred in the monuments and who are perhaps commanding them to build them? We may never know that bit. But certainly all of a sudden we're looking at everything we've written about Newgrange in the past 20 years and we're saying, well, it's going to have to be revised to some degree,
Amazing. This last few minutes, I think we might have exploded a few brains and at the very least given much food for thought. There's so much contained in what we've just covered. I'm sure we will have to revisit it again. If not by popular demand, then our own fascination will drive us here again.
And of course the research is ongoing with the DNA analysis as well. They're widening the samples, so I think we will have plenty more to be talking about as the results come in.
Well, of course, the number is very important, because a previous study had 3 Bronze Age samples and 1 Neolithic. Now we have 42 Neolithic and 2 Mesolithic. So with that expanded data set, we can do so much more. It really it's an exciting time to be involved in this. We're finding out, we're starting to lean towards answers to the big questions.
Yeah. And on that note, I think it's time to draw our conversation to an end, unfortunately.
But hey, there will be a next time.
Yeah.
I look forward to it.
Anthony, thank you so much for being with us, and for all the detail that you bring to this area, which can seem confusing. I hope this is little conversation has done much to unravel some of the thoughts that may have sprung up on your minds as a result of that short headline that appeared in the media a few weeks ago. And with that, we'll say thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll say cheerio. So it's bye-bye from me, and it's
bye from me,
and
bye from me. It's long before.
Cheerio, folks.
Cheerio. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching this Prehistory Guys show. There's loads more to watch, and you can get some of it on this playlist here. If you'd like to receive updates about when we publish new content, hit the subscribe button, and you can unlock even more content by becoming a Patreon supporter. Hit this button here to find out more about that. See you soon.